I have a 10-year-old son. Many times I've thought of taking him out of school and simply educating him at home. I can afford the best tutors. I have a fine home library. I believe I could so arrange things that he could get a much better education and far less time at home than he could by going to school, even though he attends what's considered to be an excellent private school. But I've realized that to take a child out of the educational establishment in the United States is to immediately rouse a dragon. The educational establishment zealously protects its mandate and monopoly. Indications that you might be able to do a better job simply because you could bring more concentration and more personalized teaching to bear fall on deaf ears. The system wants its children. Billions upon billions of dollars depend upon it. Millions of jobs, in fact, the largest industry in the country. Well, there's a book on radical views of compulsory schooling edited by William F. Rickenbacker entitled The 12-Year Sentence. It's a major attack upon compulsion in education by a group of discerning scholars and attorneys. Compulsory schooling is a relatively recent idea, but it is now embedded in the laws of all the states where it causes endless mischief. It's a boon to educationists, but grief to dissenters and taxpayers, and it poses some interesting questions. For example, what do you do if you're an Amishman and believe that most education offends God? What do you do if you're a Christian Scientist and the public schools require your child to be vaccinated before he can attend classes? What do you do if you believe in the biblical version of the creation and your children are taught Darwinian ideas? What do you do if you're a modern secularist and your school insists on teaching the biblical version of the creation? What do you do if your school is mediocre and you wish to teach your gifted child at home? What do you do if your school is infested with dope addicts, hoodlums, and depraved youngsters, but you can't afford to send your child to a good private school? What do you do if your educational bureaucracy forces ever-increasing taxes and ever-inferior schooling on you? What do you do if you desire to withdraw your child from public school one day a week for religious instruction? Well, this book, The 12-Year Sentence, is about just such problems, and it tells what the courts and educationists did to just such dissenting people who were caught in the coils of truancy law. I know I've thought a great deal about compulsory education. I don't like that word, compulsory, do you? When someone tells me I have to send my child to school, and by so doing indicating that he can do a better job of educating my child than I can, my hackles rise, and I think many people feel that way. Murray N. Rothbard, one of the writers of the book, points out that compulsory schooling began in the modern world with the Protestant Reformation. Before the Reformation, instruction had been carried out privately in church schools and universities, in private schools, and in private guild schools for occupational training. But Martin Luther, in his famous letter to the German rulers in 1524, urged the establishment of public schools and compulsory attendance, and did so on the basis of a military analogy. He wrote, "Dear rulers, I maintain that the civil authorities are under obligation to compel the people to send their children to school. If the government can compel such citizens as are fit for military service to bear spear and rifle, to mount ramparts, and perform other material duties in time of war, how much more it has a right to compel the people to send their children to school, because in this case we're warring with the devil, whose object it is secretly to exhaust our cities and principalities of their strong men." Well, influenced by Luther, the German state of Gotha founded the first modern public schools in 1524. Thuringia followed suit in 1527. Luther himself devised the Saxony school plan, which was established in Saxony in 1628. The first compulsory attendance system was established again under Lutheran influence by the Duke of Württemberg in 1559. Attendance was compulsory, detailed records were kept, and fines were levied on truants. The major purpose of the school system was theocratic, to use the power of the government to compel adherence to Lutheranism and to aid in the suppression of dissent from the established church. The other leading influence on the establishment of compulsory schooling in the modern world, and one even more relevant to the United States, was that other great reformer, John Calvin. Once again, the major object for public schools was to inculcate obedience to a Calvinist-run government and thereby to aid in the suppression of dissent. Control their little minds, and you can control them when they grow up. And that's my comment, not Murray Rothbard's. People think of compulsory education as something which will guarantee the best possible education because it's in the hands of the school authorities. But a good friend of mine told me that he's attended educational conventions and conferences which covered a multitude of subjects, virtually all of them related to the people in the educational establishment, but he never once heard anyone at any of these meetings or conferences ask the question, how can we do a better job of educating the children? The purpose of my comments here is not to criticize the quality of American education. That's been done by people much better qualified than I, many of them in the educational establishment. But to pose the question, is compulsory education, is the taking of our children away from us for the purpose of learning in their and our best interest? Perhaps in most cases it is. In fact, were it not compulsory, I'd say that in the vast majority of cases our system of education is excellent. But I don't think it applies to all, for many of the reasons I outlined earlier. Anyway, I'm putting the 12-year sentence on the recommended reading list. I'm sure educators will find it as interesting as we more passive parents. Another book I'm recommending is Why Marriage by Edward E. Ford, with Robert L. Zorn, with a foreword by my friend Dr. William Glasser. We asked why education must be compulsory, so why marriage? As Edward E. Ford writes in a preface, down through the ages when men of great creativity have written new and exciting ideas, many who have known them and who have liked what these men had to say then attempted to popularize what was said. This is what I've attempted to do, he writes, with the creative thoughts of Dr. William Glasser, author of Reality Therapy, Schools Without Failure, and the Identity Society. The impact of Dr. Glasser's ideas has yet to be fully realized, but the simplicity and profoundness of his words are having wide acceptance. Those who hear and read what he has to say have said these ideas make sense, and they work. And I see this book as one of many which will attempt to popularize reality therapy for the general public. But what about marriage? Is it here to stay, or is it not such a good idea after all? Well, the author writes, I believe marriages of the future will continue to be what they are today. One man and one woman in a close personal relationship. There are a great many reasons why this type of relationship will continue. One reason is simply the joy of love two people find together as husband and wife. Another reason is that the marriage-family concept, as it is known today, is the best way to bring up children. It's also the best way to teach children the meaning of love and concern. You know, the family is the only place, the only agency in our system in which love is taught. Basically, all children learn about love relationships by observing and imitating others. If all they experience in a home is fighting, children learn little about love. What they do learn is how to fight. To a large extent, children are a reflection of the home in which they're raised. If their home is full of laughter and love, the children will live and spread what they've learned. Anyway, I think you and your spouse will enjoy reading Why Marriage. It so happened that my time for writing this issue of Direct Line fell in December 1974. In fact, as I wrote the words I'm sharing with you now, the date was December 31st, 1974, the last day of a busy and crisis-filled year. As I sat down to my typewriter, newspaper headlines across the country, and the Western world for that matter, carried stories of deepening recession and increased unemployment. Once again, our most amazing invention was in a state of nerves and near panic. That invention, of course, is culture. Sociologically speaking, culture, according to my excellent Random House Dictionary, is the sum total of ways of living built up by a group of human beings and transmitted from one generation to another. The sum total of ways of living, but the human way of living, an invented, a contrived, a different way of living from that with which we were originally endowed. That's what makes it shaky at times. Culture is an invention. It's something we consider to be an improvement over the so-called natural way in which we found ourselves, living in the forests and savannas, living off the bounty of nature, as do all other so-called wild creatures on earth. Much of human culture rests upon economics. Staying with my Random House Dictionary, economics is the science dealing with the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services, or the material welfare of mankind. Without material welfare, everything else tends to break down. As a species, it's too late to return to the forests, savannas, and beaches, to that island time of which Mr. Stetzel writes in his book School for the Young. We've been too long gone from that kind of existence. It's as Thomas Wolfe once put it, you can't go home again. Evolutionally, we've burned our bridges behind us, and we stand today on the continent we've chosen. There's no going back, even if we wanted to, and you'd be hard-pressed, I think, to find many who'd even want to go back. We invented culture, we invented economics, and even called it a science, believe it or not. E.F. Schumacher, in his book Small is Beautiful, states that economics is not a science at all, but rather an imperfect art form with which we continue to struggle as we search for stability. But what does all of this mean to you and me? Well, certainly we as persons can't do much about global economics and stability of human culture. Well, to an extent, we can do something about it. We can make certain that the organization of which we are the head, our family, and in many cases our business firms, are in good economic order. If the economic order is good, that which is built upon it, culture, this business of living as intelligent and civilized human beings and doing some of the things we like to do, is possible. If the economic base is bad, the entire hierarchy of things which make culture culture tends to collapse, and everything becomes very primary again, very primitive. It becomes a matter of food and shelter. And when staying alive and out of the elements become the primary considerations of the human creature, much of what makes him human tends to fade. The first thing to disappear when you're hungry is your sense of humor, and when you're struggling for survival, the good of the species becomes academic. But let's keep economics in its place. Things seem to be in a state of turmoil, and whenever this happens, I dig down for basics. Now, we have them with the facts of culture and economics, with those very human inventions which we shall consider to be basically good as starting points. Where do we go from there? For answers of this kind, you simply cannot do better than to go back to that ugly philosopher, Socrates, son of a stonecutter and a midwife, enormously strong, very brave, charming, and brilliant. He believed that success could never be more than a short-term affair unless it was founded on logical truth and moral right. He told us what the most prized possession is, the one good and the one evil. Do you remember what they were? In times like these, it's easy to forget. Once, when looking at a variety of merchandise exposed for sale, Socrates was heard to observe, "How many things I can do without." He said he was nearest to the gods because he had the least number of wants. About that most prized possession, Socrates said that it's leisure. And he recognized only one good, knowledge, and only one evil, ignorance. He married twice, the second time to Xantippe, a shrew who screamed at him whenever he was within earshot and often hit him, sometimes even in public. When asked why he put up with such behavior, he said in effect that it was good training because if you could stand her, you could stand anything else that might happen to you. And when someone asked him whether to marry or not, Socrates replied, "Either way, you will repent it." In his excellent book, Understanding Philosophy, A Popular History of Ideas, Professor Feebleman writes that, lurking behind the conversations of Socrates, there can be detected the ultimate question of human behavior. What is the final end of man? To enrich himself while he's alive? To cultivate a strong character and the many personal virtues? Or to be so productive that he leaves the world a better place for his having lived in it? Most men would choose the first. Socrates liked the second, and I myself, Professor Feebleman writes, prefer the third. I'll go over them again. The first is to enrich himself while he's alive. The second is to cultivate a strong character and the many personal virtues. And the third, the one that Professor Feebleman prefers, is to be so productive that he leaves the world a better place for his having lived in it. Now, Socrates was thought to be the wisest man of his times. The oracle at Delphi said he was the wisest man. When he learned of that, the only answer that Socrates could give was that if he were indeed the wisest man alive, it was because he knew what he did not know. He placed so little value on what he thought and said that he never wrote down a word for posterity, nor would he accept money for his teachings. He remains to this day one of the wisest human beings the world ever produced, and his teachings represent a rock-solid foundation on which to build a life or a business. He said success can never be more than a short-term affair unless it's founded on logical truth and moral right. Leisure is the most prized of possessions. The only good is knowledge. The only evil, ignorance. Doesn't take long to learn his philosophy, does it? And what is the final end of a person? To enrich himself while he's alive? To cultivate a strong character and the many personal virtues? Or to be so productive that he leaves the world a better place for his having lived in it? Well, as to choosing a way to live, a nice balance of those three choices can be achieved. Chances are that a person would lean a bit toward one or the other, but he could do all three. He could cultivate a strong character and many personal virtues, be so productive that he could leave the world a better place for his having lived in it, and at the same time enrich himself to a sufficient extent that he could live what we might call the good life. And that's what a person might be thinking about these days, the basics. They tend to clear the mind and get things on a solid footing once again. The other morning, driving to my office, I heard one of my own radio programs in which I recommended writing our problems down on paper. I still think it's an excellent idea. It's been said that a problem defined is half solved, and if we find ourselves enmeshed in the coils of the times, we can write our problems down and then, reminding ourselves of Socrates' excellent advice, begin from there. I imagine most people are rather surprised to find that Socrates declared leisure to be the most prized of possessions. If they do, it's because they've confused leisure with doing nothing. We would not have culture, or economics, or books telling us about Socrates if we had not had leisure. Remember that Newton was sitting under the apple tree when that apple dropped on his head. Our best ideas invariably come to us in periods of leisure. Leisure not only helps us find the ideas we're looking for, it rests us for the labor of putting those ideas into action. Millions spend their days at work they dislike or at best tolerate so that they may enjoy their leisure. Leisure is what it's all about, and Socrates knew that. His great dialogues, recorded so faithfully by Plato, were conducted at leisure. Plato, a wealthy aristocrat, had the leisure to write and to think and to imagine what the ideal city-state might be like, and his student, Aristotle, had the leisure to think and write. In our society, most of us can provide our children with the leisure to go to school for as long as they deem necessary. Although few of them would consider school leisure, it would be impossible or very difficult without it. Socrates had a fixed goal in life, to lead men to the truth. The truth, he thought, could not fail to win out in the end, regardless of its temporary consequences, and the truth, he also believed, would make virtue unassailable. Unfortunately, Socrates got mixed up with a losing side in a political struggle. His enemies, led by Miletus, accused him of corrupting the youth by making the worse cause appear the better, and they condemned him to death. He was, in a way, almost a religious figure of reason incarnate and the world's first martyr to the truth. Actually, as Professor Feebleman reminds us, those who had convicted him did not want to see him a martyr, and his friends were allowed to conspire with the jailer to help him escape, but he refused. And in the Phaedo, in one of the most moving accounts in all literature, Plato describes his last day in his cell with his friends and the manner of his execution. He was condemned to drink hemlock, a deadly poison, and did so, discoursing all the while on philosophy while his friends stood around him and wept. After his death, the Athenians felt such remorse that they closed the schools, put Miletus to death, and banished the other accusers. Then they honored Socrates with a bronze statue, which did not, of course, bring him back, although it did much to spread his teaching, which was left chiefly to his pupils. It's believed that Socrates lived to be 70, which was a pretty good old age for the time, 399 B.C. In the centuries, between the time of Socrates and our own time, we've had as many ups and downs as there have been seasons of the years. But we've never had a clearer thinker than Socrates. We can put his wisdom to work in our lives today, and we will achieve, without fail, the results we seek. I mentioned E.F. Schumacher in his book Small is Beautiful. In a paper on meta-economics contributed to the volume Beyond Keynes, edited by Joan Robinson, Dr. Schumacher shows at the conclusion of his paper, as reported in Manus, that the attempt to describe and eventually to control the economic activities of human beings by means of economic models necessarily requires a ruthless and extreme simplification of the picture of man. Man is seen either as a mechanical robot whose reactions are ascertainable and predictable like those of mindless matter, or as a rational homo economicus solely concerned with material self-enrichment. Neither of these two pictures bears the mark of humanity. An economic teaching built on such a basis cannot possibly be helpful in solving the economic problems now oppressing us, and I'd go so far as to say, he writes, that the intensive study of such a teaching, although it may in some respects be useful, does considerably more harm than good. For every man in the course of his life becomes what he thinks, is formed by his thoughts. If what he thinks is narrow and unreal, he himself becomes narrow and unreal. Now, as Manus points out, this gets to the point. If we approach our problems as something economic science can solve, then we shall be behaving in exactly the way we've behaved in the past. Economic man is helpless to change as economic man. Even prudential considerations applied toward conservation do not work, as Aldo Leopold shows in the concluding chapter of the Sand County Almanac. After describing the failures of conservation based upon economic calculations, he says, "It is inconceivable to me that an ethical relation to land can exist without love, respect, and admiration for the land and a high regard for its value. And by value, I of course mean something far broader than mere economic value. I mean value in the philosophical sense." Well, now the question arises, how do people achieve a sense of value in the philosophical sense? Well, Schumacher says that people are formed by their thoughts, that they become what they think. Now, if this is the case, and I certainly believe it is, then the content of our minds, what we occupy our thoughts with as real, as enduring, as having value, is crucial to the problems which lie before us. While our problems seem to hurt us at the economic level, they did not originate at the economic level. They began with what we've thought about ourselves. And later on in the article, it's pointed out that our difficulty is mainly that we hope for the same sort of certainty in an alternative kind of thinking that we've enjoyed in scientific calculations and their technological applications. This is the exactitude of standardization, of uniformity, of predictability, and of single-valued thinking. The thinking we need to adopt, little by little, is the independent thinking of individuals, without certification from any authority, guided only by those inner disciplines which, for the artist, who may here serve as a model, become his sense of limit, his recognition of fitness, his insistence upon a fineness of form. In short, by what is for us an educated voice of conscience. A company of conscientious men makes an illuminated community, and such communities are the seedbed of civilized society. We're speaking, we suppose, of what might be called a consensus of human enlightenment. How else should we speak of it? The outlook has some uniformity, but agreement is reached spontaneously, never by plan, so the advocate of philosophic reform, the man who speaks in the language of Blake, of Tolstoy, of Buddha, or Socrates, is at a serious disadvantage when invited to explain what will take the place of scientific certainty. He has no similar certainty to offer, and perhaps no ordinary certainty at all. This advocate speaks to us in the idiom of self-discovered truth. Should he try to imitate the precise language of science, he soon becomes a dogmatist, which makes him guilty of the greatest possible offense against the spirit of religion, worse by far than mere materialism, which is only honest skepticism or unbelief. Dogma is an attempt to standardize what is by nature unique, without duplicate, and unrepeatable, save at a distance in the moral ephemera of the arts. The arts do not pretend to reveal religious truth, although they may supply its most representative symbols. In the discipline of the arts, we may find suggestive analogies of what is involved in the independent pursuit of religious and philosophic truth. Little wonder, then, that the greatest of religious teachers, Buddha and Christ, refused to write anything down. They left such tasks to their less illustrious followers as a way of guarding against slavish belief. Unfortunately, such measures do not always work in the way that's desired. In his essay, Civilization and the Arts, W. McNeill Dixon gives the arts a high meaning that is seldom encountered these days, yet one with immeasurable restorative value for our impoverished civilization. He writes, "There is, as everyone knows, a province of human life, and only upon reflection do we perceive how vast, how boundless is that province, to whose interests and problems the most extensive knowledge or control of nature's machinery affords no entrance, a country upon which the bright sun of science sheds not a ray of light. It is the country of the soul. We have our affections and sympathies, we have loves and friendships, we have hopes and fears and admirations, inmates of a province of real things as broad and deep as the telescopic heavens above our heads. And of these things science never speaks. She sits above the battle and has no share in our joys and sorrows. Of good and evil, freedom and justice, science has nothing to say. The scientific vocabulary does not include such words as beauty or heroism, nobility or charm, resignation or despair, kindness or generosity, character or conduct. Not until you ponder such words do you perceive how narrow and inhuman is the view that omits them, the internal experiences with which our minds are so continuously occupied from the cradle to the grave." And Dixon used the arts to suggest our need for becoming, as Nietzsche put it, entangled in the infinities. The arts are purposefully vague, as well as naturally so. And Dixon's justification makes the conclusion of the Manus article. When you enter the temple of the arts, you enter a building dedicated to the muses, and the soul is there disturbed by a sense of how great and terrible, how strange and beautiful is this universe of ours. Make human life as trivial as you please. There remains the simple, positive, undeniable fact among other facts, the eating, drinking, walking, and talking, that we are taking part in cosmic affairs of a magnitude beyond all imagination to compass or language to express. All finite things have their roots in the infinite, and if you wish to understand life at all, you cannot tear it out of its context. All finite things have their roots in the infinite, and if you wish to understand life at all, you cannot tear it out of its context. For every man in the course of his life becomes what he thinks, is formed by his thoughts. If what he thinks is narrow and unreal, he himself becomes narrow and unreal. I think that most of the problems facing us as a species and as individuals come from too narrow a view of just what we are in the context of what the universe is. We tend to lose sight of the mystery, the awesome, unbelievable, mind-boggling mystery of it all, and become as menial clerks in a Dickens novel with eye shades sitting at high desks, totally immersed in columns of figures. We might as well be immersed in chicken tracks or mumbledy-peg. Make human life as trivial as you please. There remains the simple, positive, undeniable fact, among other facts, that we're taking part in cosmic affairs of a magnitude beyond all imagination to compass or language to express. All finite things have their roots in the infinite, and if you wish to understand life at all, you cannot tear it out of its context. I think when we think in these terms, we put culture and economics in their proper perspective. Important? Yes, certainly. But very small parts of a very large and completely incomprehensible whole. In looking at a tree, we shouldn't lose sight of the sky. In looking at a grain of sand, which is our world, we shouldn't lose sight of the endless desert about us. When we see creation in this sense, our problems, real as they are to us, shrink to their proper size, and our opportunities take on their true magnitude. Yes, we become what we think. We're formed by our thoughts. If what we think is narrow and unreal, which has to be the way most people think, we ourselves become narrow and unreal, pinched and ridiculous, insignificant and ineffectual. What are you thinking about? As human beings, it's difficult, since we tend to take ourselves for granted, to realize that we are greater than our creations, economics and all other so-called civilized artifacts. We have powers which transcend the things we've created. As I quoted from Manus, if we approach our problems as something economic science can solve, then we shall be behaving exactly the way we've behaved in the past. Economic man is helpless to change as economic man. It takes something more, and that something more can be found in the statement that people are formed by their thoughts, that they become what they think. If this is the case, and it most assuredly is, then the content of our minds, what we occupy our thoughts with as real, as enduring, as having value, is crucial to the problems which lie before us. Now, while our problems seem to hurt us at the economic level, they did not originate at the economic level. They began with what we have thought about ourselves. If we think of our problems and goals in strictly economic terms, if we permit that kind of thinking to dominate our minds, if we believe that kind of thinking is real and of enduring value, we're limiting ourselves to the level of our own inventions. We're forcing ourselves to become mechanical robots, no better than our machines. We've all known people whose lives were strictly limited to economic considerations, and we've been appalled and dismayed by how small they seem to be, how limited their horizons, how curtailed their education. They seem truncated, less than what we expect a human being to become. The secret is to be found in that statement that people are formed by their thoughts. With their habitual thoughts, they shape and form themselves as creatures, as do you and I. And in times such as those we're experiencing, as I write and speak these words, it's good to remember that our eyes, our minds should be fixed on goals worthy of us as emerging, maturing, growing human beings. We can remember the words of Socrates that Success can never be more than a short-term affair unless it's founded on logical truth and moral right. There's so much to be done within the framework of truth and right. Millions are successful today within that framework, and yet may have never thought about or analyzed the real basis of their success. People who live by the numbers become numbers. People who are unaware of the mysterious nature of things, who do not seem to have what we might call a religious or philosophical nature or insight or awareness, probably seldom know the joy of creation, and by that I mean the joy that comes from creating with our minds. We can forget the times, the problems, the difficulties that appear to be everywhere, and by setting our minds on worthwhile goals, transcend the numbers and the mundane we find everywhere about us. The fact is that we don't need to know where what we seek will come from. That's economic thinking. We're above, we're bigger than that. We can pull our goals right out of the mysterium tremendum. The fact that we don't know how the mind works to translate systematically held thoughts into reality shouldn't bother us any more than any of the other mysteries by which we're perpetually surrounded. It's simply the perennial philosophy. It works. I set my mind on something I want very much to bring about. I hold that thought until it permeates my habitual thinking. Somehow that idea becomes a germinating seed, and eventually, sooner or later, and quite often much sooner than we might have believed possible, that thought becomes a reality in my life. I have become what I've thought about. I've achieved that upon which I seriously set my mind. I have extracted something from where before there was nothing but an invisible idea. We can call it magic. We can festoon it with all manner of fancy trappings. We can build temples to the mystery behind it. We can do anything we like except explain it, and if it could be explained, if it could be reduced to dogma, it would become standardized. It would no longer be unique and without duplication. And as we mentioned, little wonder then that the greatest of religious teachers, Buddha and Christ, refused to write anything down. They left such tasks to their less illustrious followers. Buddha is credited with having said, "All that we are is the result of what we have thought. All that we are is founded on our thoughts and formed of our thoughts. If a man speaks or acts with an evil thought, pain pursues him as the wheel of the wagon follows the hoof of the ox that draws it. If a man speaks or acts with a pure thought, happiness pursues him, like his own shadow that never leaves him." What are we trying to build, you and I? We're involved as human creatures in organizations. The family is an organization. The company or agency or church or fraternity or profession in which we earn our way in the world is an organization. Our country is an organization. The world is an organization. What is the purpose of an organization? The primary function of any organization is to help men and women enjoy a more meaningful existence. That's all there is to it. That's the purpose of our families, our company or other organization, our country, the entire human enterprise. The primary function of any organization is to help men and women enjoy a more meaningful existence. Is your family conducted toward that end? Is your company? Is our nation? Now Dixon's great quotation takes on new meaning, doesn't it? When you enter the temple of the arts, you enter a building dedicated to the muses, and the soul is there disturbed by a sense of how great and terrible, how strange and beautiful is this universe of ours. Make human life as trivial as you please. There remains the simple, positive, undeniable fact, among other facts, the eating, drinking, walking, and talking, that we're taking part in cosmic affairs of a magnitude beyond all imagination to compass or language to express. All finite things have their roots in the infinite, and if you wish to understand life at all, you cannot tear it out of its context. If you wish to understand life at all. This is Earl Nightingale, and thank you.